Hey, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. Welcome back. Well, unless you've been in a cave for the last week, you know there's a vacancy on the United States Supreme Court and a fierce partisan debate going on over whether that vacancy should be filled so close to a presidential election. It reminded me of another nomination to the Supreme Court 220 years ago, also in the midst of a fierce partisan struggle over the presidency in the election of 1800. I'm talking about the appointment of the great Chief Justice, John Marshall. John Marshall was a cousin of Thomas Jefferson's, but they were very different in their political outlooks and in their vision of what the American government ought to be able to do and the powers that it ought to have. Marshall, like Jefferson, grew up in Virginia, was born there in 1755, but unlike Jefferson, Marshall served in the Continental Army during the American Revolution and was at Valley Forge under Washington. He suffered the privations of an army under a weak Continental Congress and a weak central government. The Continental Congress couldn't adequately supply the army with food, with ammunition, with money, supplies, all the things an army needs to survive and succeed, and it profoundly shaped Marshall's outlook for the rest of his life. He had a strong nationalist outlook, but he believed the government should have the powers that it needs in all cases. And he took that vision onto the Supreme Court when he was appointed in 1801. Marshall served and rose to the rank of captain in the Continental Army, went back to Virginia, and studied law under the preeminent jurist George Wythe at the College of William and Mary, went into the Virginia House of Delegates, and after the adoption of the U.S. Constitution in 1787, he became a member of the Federalist Party, a staunch supporter of Presidents Washington and Adams, and of the economic policies of Alexander Hamilton, all of which helped create a stronger central government. John Adams appointed Marshall as part of the Commission to France that became embroiled in what became known as the XYZ affair, returned to the States and served in the U.S. House of Representatives, and was serving as John Adams' Secretary of State during the presidential election of 1800 in that November, the first presidential election that pitted two political parties against each other, the incumbent, John Adams, and the Federalist, and his rival, Thomas Jefferson, and the Democratic-Republican Party. It was a landslide victory for Jefferson and the Republicans. They swept Adams and the Federalists out of power. The only catch was the election was in November, and unlike now, when the president's inaugurated in January, the inauguration then was in March. And so the next president wasn't going to come in for several months. The other problem was Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, both received the same number of electoral votes. The election was thrown into the House of Representatives where the Federalist Congress would decide, the lame duck Federalist Congress would decide who the next president was going to be. In the meantime, the Chief Justice, Oliver Ellsworth, stepped down that fall, and in January 1801, 2 months after being swept out of office, President Adams nominated John Marshall to be the next Chief Justice. The Federalist Senate, a lame duck Senate, all of which had been tossed out of office, took up the nomination and unanimously approved John Marshall as the fourth Chief Justice, denying the next president, which turned out to be Thomas Jefferson, the chance to appoint his own Chief Justice. Long-ranging consequences here because Marshall would serve longer than any Chief Justice for 34 years until 1835, and it was John Marshall who elevated the Supreme Court to the position it has today. It was Marshall who elevated the court to a position of co-equal branch of government that it has had ever since. In a series of cases, Marshall strengthened the power of the federal government at the expense of the states, always. Beginning with Marbury versus Madison in 1803, Marshall established the precedent of judicial review, when for the first time Congress declared the Supreme Court declared an act of Congress unconstitutional. Controversial then and has remained so ever since. In a series of other cases, Cohens versus Virginia, Fletcher versus Peck, McCulloch versus Maryland, the Dartmouth College cases, and a series of others, all in their ramifications had the effect of strengthening the national government and the supremacy of federal law over state law. This, of course, infuriated Jefferson and his party, states' writers all, infuriated them. They fumed about these judges who were appointed, not elected, not accountable to the people, who served for life, who were setting precedent and setting policy and setting laws and were not answerable to the people. It set up the kind of challenge to the laws that we've seen up to the present day. Nevertheless, it was Marshall and his laying the foundation for the federal government that would be able to destroy slavery through emancipation in the Civil War, that would help end legalized segregation in the civil rights movement of the 20th century that would meet the economic needs of a country during the Great Depression in the 1930s, and that would set the United States on the path of global leadership to the 20th century. All of that unthinkable without the foundation laid by John Marshall and the Supreme Court in the first third of the 19th century. Now, Marshall served longer than any other Chief Justice through 5 presidential administrations from Jefferson to Andrew Jackson, and died in July 1835. It was at his funeral procession in Philadelphia that the Liberty Bell cracked. And late in his life, John Adams said that his proudest act was his gift to the American people of John Marshall. If Thomas Jefferson had been allowed to appoint his own Chief Justice in March of 1801, the course of subsequent American history likely would have been very different. What is going to happen in our present contest? Stay tuned. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for watching.